Hi, everybody. Our social science research foundation is Positivism, and I'm presenting for our group of three people, Saman, Kenneth, and myself, Rachel. So first, we're going to take a look at the origins of positivism. The term appears in Francis Bacon's writings between 1561 and 1626. And then in the mid 1800s, it starts to become popularized by Auguste Comte. I'm not sure if I'm getting the pronunciations right here, but around 1848 in his formation Société Positiviste, and then he wrote a 6-volume work, Cours de philosophie positive, also popularizing positivism. And he regarded himself as a scientist at all times. And he really sought to introduce natural science methods to the practice of social sciences. Positivism flourished worldwide in the 1920s and 1930s in the form of logical positivism, and this looked to legitimize positivism. This logical positivism was kind of formed by a group of thinkers known as the Vienna Circle, and it brought the methods and exactitude of mathematics to philosophy. So looking now at what is positivism, what does it espouse? So it's a philosophical stance that posits that knowledge should be gained using methods from the natural sciences that are observable and measurable. And two important words there are observable and measurable. You'll also see it referred to as empiricism in some places. And if we're looking at some other social science research foundations, such as constructivism, then it is going to contrast with constructivism in the sense that constructivism proposes that there's not a single reality, but rather realities are based on individual perception formed through social construction. And positivism, it contradicts that idea, that there's not a single reality. So looking a bit more at what positivism is, another just simple explanation is that it is closely related to science and it champions objectivity. So again, on the previous slide, talked about how, observability, measurability is important. Objectivity, also along with observability and measurability, is an important component of positivism. And if you want a more kind of complex, detailed explanation, then be that positivism advocates objectivity, it embraces scientific inquiry to understand phenomena, and it rules out subjectivity. I'm going to try to scoot this over so that you can see, okay, that way you can see the rest of what's on the slide a little bit more easily, hopefully. So yes, rules out subjectivity. It distinguishes between what is empirical, verifiable, objective knowledge, and what is non-empirical, non-verifiable, subjective knowledge. It also does not ascribe or give meaning to something. Instead of doing that, it discovers meaning, in the sense that the meaning is already there in nature and the scientist discovers it. So again, we can kind of see this contrast with an idea like constructivism, where in constructivism, people are constructing their understanding and knowledge of the world, whereas in positivism, people are not constructing that reality or that knowledge. That knowledge is there for people to discover. So thinking a little bit about positivism today, It proposes a radical unity to all the sciences, so a thorough, far-reaching unity among all sciences. Also proposes that there are few bounds to what science is capable of achieving. So that's a very optimistic outlook on progress. And along with that comes the idea that scientific discovery and technology as a component of scientific discovery, but scientific discovery as an instrument and a driving force of progress. So here we have some related words. These are words that you're going to see when you are reading about positivism or looking at definitions of positivism. Empiricism, objectivity, validating, rationality, scientific, accuracy, verification, certitude. And these are words that can kind of better frame our understanding of positivism. So we've talked about how logical positivism kind of as being related to positivism. And then we also have the idea of post-positivism. And this kind of came about through a German scientist, Heisenberg, who introduced the whole idea of an uncertainty principle that calls into question some positivist claims. And in particular, he kind of happened upon this uncertainty principle when he was thinking about the observer's effect on the observed in a scientific study. So Heisenberg was actually, he studied quantum theory, and a very simple example of what he meant by the uncertainty principle and the effect of the observer's effect on the observed would be his observation of subatomic particles and looking at the position of a particle, the momentum of a particle, and how the observation of the particle on the part of the scientist is affecting them. So then Cresswell talks a little bit more about post-positivism, and he, rather than the strict cause and effect that we have with positivism, he talks about a probability that something may or may not happen. And then also in post-positivism, we're looking at knowledge as relative, not necessarily an absolute. Popper talks about falsification versus verification. And instead of verifying something, the idea that one instance of falsehood means it cannot necessarily be verified. And then okay. So moving on. So Cresswell talks a little bit about post-positivism and qualitative research, and much of what we've seen on the previous slides comes from Crotty, but thinking about actual quantitative and qualitative research now, Cresswell has a few words on post-positivism as it relates to research. So you're taking a scientific approach to research, typically an experiment, surveys, would fit under the realm of post-positivism, positivism. Is going to be logical, empirical, looking at cause and effect, but as stated on the previous slide, probability of cause and effect. And then the idea of qualitative research as supporting quantitative research. It will employ rigorous methods of data collection, rigorous methods of analysis. And when looking at perspectives of participants, the inclusion of multiple perspectives here, as opposed to one single reality from participants. And then the write-up of research of this nature is going to resemble a scientific report. So finally, to think about an example, we found this in the British Journal of Guidance and Counseling, and I'm going to go ahead and read this segment from the abstract because it describes a bit how they were including positivism in the study that they were conducting. So naturalistic observation of the grieving process within a logical positivist paradigm. We posit an observational protocol for the grief counseling process, which minimizes the intrusion of research method into the therapeutic process. So they then talk a little bit later in the paper about how they, for this particular topic, which actually the title of the article is Observing a Client's Grieving Process, Bringing Logical Positivism into Qualitative Grief Counseling Research. So to go back here, so they're talking about grief counseling and the research that's been done on the topic. And as in the paper, they talk about how they wanted to move beyond just quantitative methodologies. And while there's a neurological and biological basis for grief, there are neurological and biological processes that are happening wrapped up in grief. And quantitative research can be an appropriate way to look at those processes and to look at that biological basis. But they wanted to bring qualitative research into this as well because grief is also an affective state. So something like qualitative research might be able to capture an affective state. So that's why they kind of take this positivist approach to using both quantitative and qualitative research in their study. And an example of how they're using this positivism is they have a very step-by-step detailed protocol that they follow, and is a very prescribed and structured protocol. So kind of falls more into the positivist realm. So that's just one example. And then, so we consulted the Cresswell book, Crotty, Merriam's book, and then as well as the article about grief counseling to put this presentation together. And I hope that this has been helpful and informative, and look forward to your questions.